My name is Joanne Freeman, and I'm a professor of history and American studies here at Yale, and I specialize in early national political history. Usually I write about the founders, but right now I'm working on a book which you'll be hearing about this afternoon that's kind of yanked me all the way up to the Civil War. And I want to welcome you, first of all, those of you who are not normally at Yale, to this inauguration weekend, which I'm really honored to be a part of, and to my talk this afternoon, which I've titled The Field of Blood, Congressional Violence in Antebellum America. And I'll explain that title in just a couple of minutes. And let me say at the outset, I'm fighting a cold, so if I clear my throat, I'm not suggesting anything important by the clearing of the throat. I'm just clearing my throat. Now, I assure you, when I decided to give this particular talk on this particular occasion, I could not possibly have imagined how topical it would come to seem. My plan was, and still is, really to give you a sneak preview into the book that I've been working on for a good number of years, and I'm now in the process of completing it. And as the title suggests, and I think the blurb and some of the promotional material suggests, it's a book about congressional violence in the first half of the 19th century, or to be more specific, between about 1830 and the Civil War. Now, along the lines of what I just said, I have to start out with a confession, and that is, given the way that our current political situation has been evolving, I've been kind of agonizing over this lecture because I want to be informative, and I want to reveal some what I think are really interesting things to you. I also want to amuse you a little bit, and I was nervous because I thought, how am I going to amuse you in addition to informing you in a climate where so many people are angry at Congress? And I got an email about 10 days ago, which I want to mention only because I think it gave me the answer about how to approach this. And it actually was from an aide to a prominent Republican in the House, who shall go nameless, and who contacted me with a question. And he had been in touch with me once before, and this will be a little Yale promotional moment here. He'd been in touch with me once before because, as some of you may already know, Yale has been putting some of its lecture courses online in a program called Open Yale Courses. And my American Revolution course is online, and this particular aide had seen it, and he liked it, and he was nice enough to contact me and say so. So that was nice. But he contacted me again about 10 days ago, and he said that he realized I was busy, that I probably didn't have time to respond, but he was in what he called a state of despair about Congress, which isn't what you want to hear from the inside. Maybe from the outside, not from the inside. And he basically just wanted historical perspective. He wanted me just to say something about Congress, to give him some kind of insight, maybe to suggest that this sort of thing has happened before, and I suppose in some way to make him feel a little bit better. And so what I want to do this afternoon is offer you some historical perspective by talking about, and to be blunt, it all boils down to this, congressmen behaving badly in the first half of the 19th century. Now, I am going to stay firmly planted in the 19th century. There is a reason that I'm a historian, and that is I really do like to stay in the past. Particularly at times like the present, the past is a very nice place to be. So I'm not offering answers. I'm not commenting on the current Congress. I'm really offering information and insights. But I'll conclude with an interesting parallel, I think, between the 19th century Congress and the current Congress that I at least think is kind of evocative, and hopefully you'll agree. And I'm going to talk about my topic this afternoon by posing and answering 4 pretty logical questions. So first off, what are we talking about when we talk about congressional violence? Number 2, why was it happening? Number 3, why didn't anyone stop it? And number 4, what was its ultimate impact? What does it suggest? So let's start at the beginning. Question number 1, what are we talking about when we talk about congressional violence? And I'll start by saying there was a lot of it. I've been digging for it for a good many years, and at this point I found at least 125 instances of physical violence in the House and the Senate between, as I said, roughly 1830 and the Civil War, and that's not comprehensive by any means. As a matter of fact, not only is it not comprehensive, but on Thursday morning, I was testing out a database that the library was considering purchasing of British newspapers from the 19th century, and I thought, well, I'm totally single-minded here. I'll just punch in a search that relates to my book and see what happens. And bing, I came up with a new fight. thanks to the British press, which I then checked. And I can't resist, I just have to read you the headline because, well, you'll hear. Part of the headline strikes me as kind of bemusing. It's from 1852, and it started out in the British press. This is actually from the Boston Herald, because then I had to prove to myself that this really happened. And the headline in the Boston Herald is, "Disgraceful Proceedings in Congress. Fight between Brown and Wilcox on the floor of the House." And this is the part of the title, the headline that I like. "Black eyes, etc." I was like, I like the etc. Like, you all know what happens with the black eyes. So obviously, as suggested by that, by violence, I actually mean violence. I mean duels and duel negotiations, shoving and fistfights, people pulling Bowie knives and pistols on the floor, waving them around at each other, big wild melees, usually in the House, with dozens of men rolling around in the aisles, slugging each other, pulling each other's hair, a few street fights with fists, bricks, and the occasional umbrella, and a few fights in the Willard Hotel, which for some reason was a congressional violence magnet. Whenever I'm in Washington, I always stay at the Willard Hotel in honor of my book. And of course, I also mean canings, beatings with canes, like the most notorious instance of congressional violence, which is the caning of Senator Charles Sumner in 1856. And, you know, I'd say over the years, whenever I mention this project to anyone, 99%, and I would say 100%, but as a historian, I never feel comfortable saying 100% of the time about anything. But 99% of the time, if I mention this project, people will say, "Oh yeah, there was that guy," and they'll usually do this, which is Charles Sumner. And that caning, as I said, unquestionably the most famous violent incident in congressional history. And as a matter of fact, the title of my book and the title of this talk comes from a letter written to Sumner after the caning. And a friend of Sumner's wrote to him and said, quote, "That blood would flow, somebody's blood, before the expiration of your present session, on that field of blood, the floor of Congress, I have fully expected." So to this correspondent, and I thank this correspondent for giving me the title of my book, the floor of Congress was quite literally the field of blood because of all the violence. Now, all of this violence, given what I'm suggesting here, raises an obvious question, and that is, why in the world haven't historians and scholars discovered it before? And the answer is partly because people haven't been looking for it, but more than that, the violence hasn't been found because much of it was essentially censored out of the period's equivalent of the Congressional Record. And the reason for this was because of the nature of the Washington press in this period. In the 1830s, the Washington press consisted of a handful of men working for a handful of local newspapers, and a couple of them sat in the House, a couple of them sat in the Senate, and they scribbled notes, and then published their accounts of the debates in spin-off publications from the newspapers that they wrote for. And these spin-off publications basically acted as the Congressional Record. And the newspapers that they were working for were unquestionably and unapologetically partisan. So objective news had not become a goal at this point in time. So newspapers were basically party organs, and party members, and particularly in Congress, supported their newspaper in part by providing lucrative government printing contracts. So if you were a Washington reporter, this meant that you really, really wanted to keep the congressmen in your own party very happy. They gave you printing contracts, they gave you inside information, and if they weren't happy, they might beat you up, which happened more than once. So you wanted to report congressmen, particularly those on your side of the aisle, in the way that they wanted to be reported. And they weren't always eager to be reported saying and doing what they were actually saying and doing. And so for this reason, a lot of this violence actually isn't in the record. And there's actually a really comical footnote in one of the period's equivalent of the Congressional Record, and it follows this obviously really carefully worded report of a really angry debate in which clearly insults were being tossed around, but the insults aren't listed. There's, and I'll come back in a minute to typically what you tend to find when violence is not being mentioned in the record. But so there's this weird cryptic description of something happening, and you can kind of tell it's unpleasant. And then on the very bottom of the page, the reporter writes, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, he basically says, "You know, a reporter can't be too careful these days, so I'm not going to record what I actually heard during that debate. It was just too angry." And that's actually typical of the sort of thing that you find, and again, this is part of why no one has found this before. You find clues about the violence, but you don't find the actual violence. So sometimes you'll see something that says, for example, "The debate became unpleasantly personal at one time." that usually means men are slugging each other. More often than not, men are punching each other. In one case, one pulled a gun on another in one of those unpleasantly personal moments. Or you see a comment like, "There was a sensation in the corner." That particular quote comes from an instance when two congressmen began punching each other and flipped over their desks. That was a sensation. Or often you'll see a congressman rise to his feet and say very formally something along the lines of, "It gives me great pleasure to report that Mr. X and Mr. Y have made mutual apologies to each other and the matter is settled." And sometimes there actually is applause at that kind of a moment, but usually there is absolutely no information about what Mr. X and Mr. Y said or did to require a public apology. So you can see why it's taken me years to find this congressional violence. Often I have to resort to private letters and diaries, and obviously digging through them can be pretty random. So we have at least 125 fights in roughly a 30-year period. Why? Which brings us to question number 2, why all the violence? The easy answer, but only a very partial answer, is that the young American Republic was an extremely violent place, and Congress was representative. The new nation was still defining itself in a lot of ways. It was expanding across the continent. It was deciding some pretty fundamental questions in the process, and obviously the question of slavery was a major one. Politics was particularly violent. And I think it's easy to forget that our country was once so young and so experimental that people had to figure out what precisely a democratic politics was. It took learning, it took practice. There was no precise example that the United States could follow for what it was doing. And sometimes that learning process could be violent. I mean, in a way, we see this all over the world. Today, this was true as well in early America. Elections featured all kinds of mayhem. There were riots, there were canings, there were duels. There was an election riot in Washington in the 1850s that was so rowdy and uncontrolled that they called in the Marines to disperse the election and the crowd. And the Marines really dispersed the crowd because they accidentally killed a few people in trying to clear people out of the way. I think they fired a cannon, which maybe was not the best way to clear a crowd of people riding. And at the next election in Washington, when only 1 or 2 people were killed, you find people in their diary breathing a sigh of relief that it was a normal election in which there were only 1 or 2 deaths as opposed to many deaths. So politics is violent, and legislatures all over the country occasionally collapsed into mass rumbles. I think the prize for state legislative violence goes to Arkansas. Is there anyone here from Arkansas? No? Okay, then I'm safe. Arkansas in the 1830s. Is the most extreme example. And there was a debate going on in the Arkansas State House. Someone on the floor insulted the speaker, and the speaker responded by coming down from the podium and stabbing the legislator to death. He was then tried and found not guilty for excusable homicide, so that really must have been some insult if that was excusable, and reelected, which tells you something about what seemed normal in the realm of political violence. And in fact, there are a number of congressmen in this period who did some pretty serious crimes before winning election to Congress, including murder. And there were some people who quite literally wanted fighters fighting for them in Congress, and I'm going to come back to that idea in just a few minutes. But political violence was not restricted to Arkansas. There were brawls in legislatures all over the country, like one in the Massachusetts state legislature that prompted a New York Times reporter to report, quote, "There was a most heavenly time in the House for an hour or 2. It would have made a sensation even in Congress," which suggests, and it's true, Congress was indeed the national capital of legislative violence at this time. Which brings us to a deeper reason for congressional violence, which is bound up with the fact that Congress is a national institution. Congress brings together people from all over the country, and in the young United States, which was still so local and sectional in its orientation, different parts of the country played the political game differently and had different feelings about the acceptability of individual man-to-man violence. Generally speaking, Southern and Southern-born Western congressmen tended to be more violent, they were more likely to be armed, they were quicker to throw a punch, and they were more likely to willingly fight a duel. And Northerners and Northern-born Western congressmen were slower to resort to physical violence and generally uncomfortable with dueling. So to use congressional terms, and these are actually, congressmen tended to break their ranks into two kinds of men. These are actually their terms. As a historian, when your historical sources provide you with unbelievable statements, quotations, or phrases, it makes you so happy, and this is an example of that. Some men were called, quote unquote, fighting men, and other men were called, quote unquote, non-combatants. And Congress tended to understand that some in their ranks were one and some in their ranks were another. Now, you can already guess that generally speaking, this dynamic might give Southerners something of an advantage during debate because Northerners sometimes were more likely to back down rather than inflame a Southerner. And I want to offer you, and it's actually from that same thing that I just found 2 days ago, but as long as I have it, I'm going to just quote you an example of an inflamed Southerner in a violent incident, in this one that resulted in black eyes. Apparently one of them, they're both from Mississippi, and one of them said there are no secessionists in Mississippi, and the other one said, yes, there are. And the first one said, are you saying I'm lying? And the second one said, well, I suppose that is what I just said, isn't it? And then the first one slugged him, and then there was a fight. So this is how the newspaper reports what happened. Wilcox, who's one of them, jumped from his desk and cried, I can whip him, let me go, waving his arms in the air. Cries of, where's the sergeant-at-arms? Stop the fighting. My God, has Wilkins got a knife? No, I don't think he has one. 100 voices joined in the confusion, calling for the sergeant-at-arms, the officers, etc. Several of the runner boys, the pages, were knocked over in the excitement, and the greatest alarm prevailed. And the account closes with this very literal description of the speaker trying to get control of the House. And I'll read it only because I can't quite believe how literally descriptive it is. The speaker, trying to get control, knocked, is what it says, basically uses the word knocked, saying in the intervals, the chair, knock, well here, knock, no proposition until order, knock, 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 is restored. So it gives you, what I love is that, and this is not the only account that I found in which the reporter or the diarist actually records what it sounded like. Those are actually two inflamed Southerners. That's kind of typical for what a congressional fight might be like. But that one is clearly somewhat spontaneous. Some violence was not spontaneous. Some of it was actually quite deliberate and strategic. And here we come to one central reason for congressional violence. Because when important issues were at stake, fighting men, largely Southerners, pushed their advantage. They threatened and screamed and insulted and bullied to silence non-combatants or to steer their votes. So in essence, given the regional mix of men in Congress, bullying and fighting were politically useful. They were a way of claiming power on the floor. And men who deliberately deployed this strategy of debate were known, and again, this is the 19th century term for it, they were known as bullies. And you see a lot of mention in newspapers of bullies. Now, I actually know nothing about hockey, but whenever I talk about congressional bullies to anyone who knows anything about hockey, as I've now learned, there are people in hockey called hockey enforcers, and the enforcers, their job is to intimidate people on the opposing team with threats and violence. So bullies are the congressional equivalent of hockey enforcers, which is a sentence that I never thought would come out of my mouth, but is the truth. And I want to offer you just one or two examples of bullying so you can see what I'm talking about here. The first one took place in 1842 when Thomas Arnold, a Tennessee Whig, objected to the fact that Southern Democrats kept silencing John Quincy Adams. Two Southern Democrats responded by coming over to Arnold's seat, and one of them very visibly wearing a Bowie knife, and threatened to cut Arnold's throat, quote, from ear to ear if he ever objected to a Democrat ever again. That's clear bullying. Example number 2 shows the overall impact of this kind of bullying. And it takes place in 1837 when freshman Representative Joshua Giddings, an Ohio Whig, discovered that another congressman was unfairly claiming a government per diem. And he wanted to object, but his northern friends told him he'd better shut up and not say anything because the congressman collecting the per diem was a duelist, and Giddings might get killed if he piped up and objected. So here you really see the underlying, often invisible impact of congressional bullying. You see men who are too afraid to speak, trying to silence someone else from speaking up. Now, there were patterns in this kind of bullying. In the 1830s and much of the 1840s, fights tended to be largely about party conflict. Both parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, had their share of bullies who did their best to promote their party and intimidate the other party. And in this way, national parties were kind of useful because they spread around the power of Southern bullying and gave Northerners and Southerners a good reason to appease each other and compromise with each other. So at first, bullying and violence were party-oriented. Later, in the 1850s, they became more sectional and more centered around slavery, and I'm going to come back to that idea in just a few minutes. So the answer to question number 2, why was there so much violence, is largely because it was useful. It actually accomplished something for at least some people. Which leads very naturally to question number 3, why didn't someone stop the violence? Now, one obvious answer to that question relates to what I just said, which is, well, some people thought it was highly useful, so they wanted it to continue. But there were other reasons why the violence persisted. A very big one being that it was very hard to stand up and object to it without seeming cowardly. And you can see this by looking at what congressmen said when they did stand up and object to the violence. Every now and then, and this would particularly be the case if there was a mass brawl or a rumble with dozens of congressmen, something really sort of outrageous, someone would stand up, usually a non-combatant, and bemoan the state of Congress in speeches that basically always said, what's happening to Congress? What is happening to the state of the nation? This violence is shameful. We must do something. These speeches were common enough that John Quincy Adams actually made up his own name for them in his diary. He refers to them as Lamentation Speeches. So he'll describe, it'll say in his diary, Mr. Smith hit Mr. Jones over the head, and then the Lamentation Speeches started. So the same sorts of speeches, but what's interesting about them is usually they would have 2 parts. The first part would be the what's happening to Congress, this is shameful, something should be done. What is with the violence? This violence is shameful. The second part would be, but of course, I'm not afraid of the violence. I'm not afraid of anyone. I'm willing to fight everyone. I'm not scared. I'm just speaking generally about the institution of Congress. There was always chest beating involved after the sort of objection to the congressional violence. No one wanted to seem cowardly. This same kind of logic convinced virtually every congressman embroiled in a fight to surrender his congressional privilege of debate, his right not to be held personally accountable for what he said on the floor. And that's pretty much a fundamental foundation of free and fair legislative debate, that you will not be held personally accountable for what you say during debate. But most congressmen, when embroiled in a tangle, would declare that they were willingly surrendering their privilege of debate because it would be cowardly to hide behind it. So one of the reasons why the violence persisted is because it was hard to object to it without seeming cowardly. In addition, Congress did its best to regulate the violence. It didn't try to stop it, which I think, given how violent the times were and given that some people thought it was useful, would not have worked anyway. But when it came to fighting, Congress did have an interest in keeping it fair and keeping Congress functional. And it's kind of counterintuitive. But in fact, congressional violence reveals Congress acting like a community, helping to forge public apologies, enforcing unwritten rules of fair fighting, basically keeping things fair. And there's a great example of this from the 1850s. And there's an account from a congressman who describes sitting at his desk, and he glances up and he sees standing across the desk from one of his colleagues a stranger glowering with his fists clenched. Right? And so this fellow who sees this immediately thinks, oh, well, there's going to be a fight there. And as he describes his actions, he says he looked at his colleague and he looked at the stranger and he thought, well, my colleague is a bigger guy, so he could probably lick him in a fight. And he went back to work. Well, there's going to be a fight, but my friend will win. A few minutes later, he looks up, and sure enough, the fight has begun, and they're fighting. But when he noticed what he thought might be a gun in the jacket of the stranger, he ran over and positioned himself behind the stranger, didn't stop the fight, just ready to grab his arm if he reached for the weapon. Because an armed man fighting an unarmed man would be unfair, but the fight itself was fair, and so he was going to let it continue. And that's not the only instance of that in which, and as a matter of fact, famously, that happens during the caning of Sumner as well, in which someone says, stand back, it's a fair fight. That happens a lot in fights. As long as it seems fair, a fair fight by the sort of bluntest, most primitive of terms, people would let these men fight and sort of clear their name. So violence was useful, violence was strategic, and often it was seen as fair. But as I suggested before, it did seem to give an advantage to Southerners. So what happened when national political parties, combining Northerners and Southerners into one team, essentially collapsed in the 1850s? And this brings us to question number 4. What was the impact of this violence, and what does it suggest? And the answer to this question does lie in the 1850s, in the decade leading up to the Civil War. Now, I'll confess to you that as a historian, I usually resist prevailing assumptions about anything until I see primary evidence from the period that I'm studying that proves that it's true. And in my first book, which was about essentially what it felt like to be a politician on the national stage in the first decade of our government under the Constitution, I refused to assume that there was a first-party system until I saw evidence that there was one, and I never saw that evidence. I saw temporary alliances. I never saw party discipline. I didn't see real parties. I certainly didn't see a system. So the equivalent in the case of this book is there's a prevailing assumption that national politics was sort of swimming along in the first half of the 19th century and that there were crises and crises and compromises until the 1850s when things suddenly got worse and then we had a civil war. Well, although I started out the project refusing to assume that this was true, in fact, congressional violence did get much worse in the 1850s, although national politics was not necessarily swimming along happily before that point. Part of what I'm showing in my book is that the Civil War had some very long roots. But things did suddenly get much worse in the 1850s. But why? What does this suggest about the impact of congressional violence? Well, generally speaking, things got more violent in that decade for a few reasons. For one thing, as I've already suggested, national political parties began to collapse, so Southerners and Northerners weren't working in league as much as before, and there were thus fewer restraints on fighting men. National parties can be handy organizational things that encourage compromise, even in the case of antebellum America, sectional compromise, and here they were collapsing. Also, in the 1850s, things got more violent because at the same time that national parties were collapsing, sectional parties were rising, like the Republican Party, which was essentially a Northern party. And the sectional issue of slavery was coming to the fore as well. And in addition, in the 1850s, there was stronger and more organized anti-slavery sentiment in the North and more anti-slavery congressmen in Congress, and this contributed to congressional violence as well. But in addition, the press played a role in fueling congressional violence in the 1850s because the press changed in this period, beginning in the mid to late 1840s. During this general period of time, there were big technological changes. First, you get the steam-powered printing press, then you get the railroads, then you get the telegraph. And when you put these things together, they helped the press become far more national in reach and far faster in its ability to spread news around than before. So news could spread faster and further. The audience watching congressional proceedings was broader and more national than ever before. People in different parts of the country could see what other parts of the country were saying in their newspapers faster than ever before. There were out-of-town reporters sitting in the visitors' gallery in the Capitol building writing columns about Congress that were communicated throughout the country pretty quickly, more than ever before. And congressmen didn't know often even who these out-of-town reporters were, so they certainly didn't have control anymore of what was being said about Congress. So the press is becoming far more nationalized, news is becoming far more nationalized, spreading further and faster than before, and these changes really stunned congressmen. They changed the immediate local and national impact of what congressmen do in Congress. They changed how constituents interacted with their congressmen. So in essence, these technological changes in the press fundamentally changed the nature of congressional politics. And you can see this in an incident that took place in 1850. And actually, it's the response to the incident that shows this most dramatically, but I want to describe at least what leads up to it. And it's in the Senate. And it involves Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, who's trying to forge a national compromise on slavery, and Henry Foote of Mississippi, who's holding firm on slavery and does not want that kind of a compromise. And Foote is interested in defeating and discrediting whatever Benton is saying and doing to defeat and discredit his attempt at compromise. To do that, Foote decides he's going to prove that Benton is not a real Southern man. He's a traitor to the South, so he shouldn't be trusted. His compromise shouldn't be trusted. And to prove that Benton wasn't a real Southerner, Foote began to bully him, insulting him, and then essentially saying things like, "Are you willing to duel me for that insult? Because you should be. And if you're not a real Southern man." He did this for days and days and days, and Benton actually really tried to take it, and eventually Benton just snapped, quite literally, threw back his chair, almost knocked over his desk, lunged at Foote, and Foote, who I think knew sooner or later this was not going to end well, had armed himself in preparation for this moment and pulled his gun and aimed it at Benton, which resulted in what one senator called a stampede, with congressmen running over their desks, grabbing at both congressmen to hold them back, trying to get their hands on the gun, and standing on chairs to see what was happening. And inevitably, when fights were happening, particularly in the House, which was so large, there were always people standing on chairs on the floor trying to see what was going on. In the committee reports reporting these fights, there's always people who say, "And then I jumped up on my chair. I couldn't see what was happening in the corner of the room." Now, eventually things calmed down, people took their seats, and here comes the moment where the press and the changes in the press and its implications come through. People take their seats, and a New Hampshire senator stands up and basically says, "Excuse me for interrupting here, gentlemen, but before we begin again with whatever we were talking about, I feel the need to say that thanks to the Telegraph, within an hour, people all over America are going to be reading that we're slaughtering each other here in the Senate. And there's absolutely nothing that we can do about that." And you can virtually hear the stunned silence, because he's right, that greets that kind of a statement. Oh yeah, we actually have no control over the spread of this news, but sure enough, it's going to spread within an hour. Technological changes threw these congressmen off balance. News from the National Center could reach people all over the nation in a very short amount of time. And one of my favorite, this is my offering of congressional trivia for you to take away. I am offering you a gift of congressional trivia that will be handy at cocktail parties in the future. It relates to this idea about people suddenly realizing that they can communicate so much more quickly with their constituents and so much more directly. And this involves the word bunk, which means claptrap and nonsense the way we now use it. That word actually originated in Congress, which maybe isn't surprising, I don't know. But the source of it is really interesting. Throughout this period, congressmen increasingly realized that they could stand up and make speeches aimed back home and not for each other. And early on in this discovery process, there was a congressman from North Carolina who did this so frequently and who I think others found him to be so tedious at the frequency with which he would stand up and say something that was meant to be inflammatory but not meant to be heard on the floor, that he would stand up and say, "Okay, folks, this is a speech for Buncombe, North Carolina." And the other congressman would know, okay, we don't really have to pay attention. These speeches came to be known as Buncombe speeches. And you'll see in people's letters, well, today was Buncombe Day, everyone stood up and talked to their constituents and not to each other. That word essentially gets shortened down to bunk. And that's where that word comes from. So I offer you that piece of trivia to take away, my little gift to you. So congressional events are making their way out to the nation, including Buncombe, North Carolina, faster than ever before. And the reverse holds true as well. Thanks to that same technology, congressmen know what their constituents are thinking far more readily than before, and things that congressmen say back home, however extreme, were winging their way to the national center much more quickly and easily than in the past. So, for example, in the 1850s, an anti-slavery congressman made a really flaming anti-slavery speech back home in Massachusetts, and when he got back to Washington and went back to Congress, a Southerner rose during debate and called him on it, basically saying, "I know what you said about the South back in Massachusetts. I read it in the paper. I know that you called us savages and barbarians. Do you really think you can do that and then come back here and take Southerners by the hand and work with us as colleagues?" And clearly, this Southerner is saying the answer is no. So you can see how this sort of technological changes are really complicating congressional proceedings, which were and are fundamentally grounded on community and compromise. Congress was sectionally polarized, national politics was sectionally polarized, the press increasingly was becoming sectionally polarized, and politicians hadn't yet figured out how to handle this sort of newfangled press. And you can really see the impact of this state of affairs in the North in this period, because not only were Northerners electing more anti-slavery congressmen and more aggressively anti-slavery congressmen, but thanks to the combination of polarized politics and a more nationalized press, Northerners began actively cheering on their congressmen to fight in ways that they never had before. They had a better view of what was going on in Congress. They could see their representatives standing up for their cause, and they could see more of the fighting because more of the fighting was being reported. They liked what they saw, and they told their representatives that they liked it. And I've seen dozens of these letters from constituents to their congressmen, basically saying in one way or another, fight them, attack them, at last there is a North, basically cheering on Northerners to fight Southerners in Congress, and meaning it quite literally. Most remarkably of all to me, in the late 1850s, some Northerners were sending guns to their congressmen, telling them to wear them on the floor so they show. By the late 1850s, you had armed groups of Northerners and Southerners running at each other in the House. And you had reporters commenting that these brawls looked remarkably like battles, which indeed they were. In some ways, you could argue that the first battles of the Civil War were fought on the floor of Congress. And the press was part of the tangle of things that contributed to this state of affairs. Now, of course, a free press is also the very foundation of a democratic politics, and that's an idea certainly within our government that goes back to even before the government existed. It goes all the way back, among other things, to James Madison, who said very wisely right at the outset that given how geographically extended this republic was, given how large this nation was, the press basically had to be almost a branch of government because it would be the only way to enforce accountability in this new government, the only way to connect people to each other and to the government and vice versa. So the press is an essential part of democracy. So it makes sense that dramatic changes in the press can complicate a democratic politics. So what I'm talking about here is dramatic technological innovations changing the nature of the press, making it more responsive to the public, making congressmen more immediately accountable, making politics even more polarized, and changing the nature of Congress. That's happening in the 1850s, and some version of that is happening now, which brings us back to the present. Because I think in the same way that the 19th century Congress was figuring out how to handle the telegraph, the current Congress is struggling to figure out how to handle the internet and cell phones and 24/7 cable news coverage. Today, as in the 19th century, technology has suddenly made the connection between congressmen and their constituents more immediate, more direct, and congressmen and the public haven't quite figured out what this means or how to handle the new vulnerabilities and capabilities being caused by it. Now, obviously, this is the evocative and I think interesting parallel that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Oddly enough, the same anxiety and confusion and grandstanding and extremism that my 19th century congressmen were grappling with are in the air again. Now, as I said at the outset, I'm not offering answers here. I'm not offering advice here. Equally important, I'm definitely not comparing the present day to the lead up to the Civil War. There are vast differences of politics, of policies, and of party dynamics that make it impossible to line up these two periods as equivalent. But what I am saying is that technology plays an interesting and I think sometimes underappreciated role in the polarization of a democratic politics. And certainly it did in the first half of the 19th century, and I think this is a really interesting moment because I think just in the last, 8 to 10 years, we're watching politics figure out what it can and can't do with technology as well. Thank you very much.